Well, I was born in Brooklyn, New York in 1927. My father's name was Max, and my mother's name was Lillian. They both came over from Europe at different times, and after they met, they found they had lived in the same house back in Russia at different times. So there was that sort of a relationship, and I don't know exactly where and when they met. Yes, I had my eldest brother, Herman, 9 years older than I am or was. And then the second brother was 7 years older than me. His name was Archie. And I have a younger sister named Grace. Yes, mostly in Coney Island. So it was a lot of fun. It was always a carnival all year long. I was 1 year in college and, oh no, when it started in 1941, so I was 27, that made me 14. No, my grandfather was a Republican, my father was a Democrat, but they rarely discussed things. Well, I guess I should say I was very interested in social things, and at the beginning I was an FDR solid Democrat, but as I got older and I saw what was happening, at least to my viewpoint, I became a solid Republican. Well, there was always the discussion of what was happening to the Jews in Germany. That was a major discussion. But the thing I remember the most, as I was mentioning it earlier, is how united the country was at that time. Everybody was sort of like one behind winning the war. Now, my older brother, he enlisted in the Army before Pearl Harbor, and he ended up becoming a second lieutenant, and he became a paratrooper. The younger brother, Archie, he was a Marine paratrooper. He was wounded in Saipan, but it all ended up okay. So when I when I finished my first year of college, I was just shy of 18, and I said, well, if my brothers were Army and Marines, I'm going to join the Navy. So I joined the Navy. I was in boot camp when they dropped the A-bomb, so the war was over. So my World War II experience is very limited. I'm really here mostly to honor my brothers than me. It just was in the air all about us that we've got to win this war. And everything from various drives, get the aluminum pots and pans, and everybody would be gathering them up and things like that. Well, because you had to make munitions, and metal was short, I assume, and aluminum was very important to the war effort. So there was always an aluminum drive. And everybody, young kids and everybody, would go house to house collecting the aluminum and bringing them to a place where they could be used for the war effort. Well, to get into the Navy, because they weren't allowing anybody in, if you were over 18, you couldn't get in. I wasn't 18 yet. And they weren't accepting anybody unless there was a special reason, and so they had an electronic test, an IQ test called the Eddy test. I took it and passed, and so they took me in 3 days before my 18th birthday when I would no longer be able to get in. Well, when the war ended, the Navy kept its promise, even though the war ended, and sent me to various electronic schools, and so I was in various parts of the country, like Chicago, Milwaukee, Gulfport, Mississippi. And it was a real good experience for me because I was very closeted in New York, surrounded by the New York atmosphere, and I didn't know what the rest of the country was like, and it was very good to see it. And since everybody was behind the military, I was getting the best of both worlds. I was having a lot of fun. Well, I went back to my college after Cooper Union, and I graduated as an electrical engineer. Later on in 1955, I got my master's degree at Syracuse University. The original college was Cooper Union, a small college in New York. So my career was mostly electrical engineering and electronic and computer engineering, mostly related to aircraft. In those days, you would go to Hebrew school and you would learn to read Hebrew, but it wasn't necessary to understand what you were reading. And all of the teachers would give you good grades if you could rattle it off fast. And then there was I guess you call them malamids, people who come around and tutor you. And I had this, I'll tell a funny story. Imagine me as a young kid. He would come sit at the table, an old guy with a beard, and he asked me to read. And if I read something fast, it was good. If I read it slow, it was bad. And once in a while, he would fall asleep. So I would wait, and then when he woke up, I would read the last line, like I had done the whole thing, and he was so proud of me. He thought I had read the whole thing. Well, not so much about the Jewish community, but my mother, who left when she was older than when my father, had a whole bunch of stories about the way the farming went, what the countryside was like. She told a story about the village saw their first can of pineapples and they didn't know what it was and they were all excited, things like that. Well, when we came here, the temple was in small quarters, a private home. It had a long hallway, and at the end of it is where the bima was, and people were sitting in the hallways. The classrooms were in the bathrooms, and it was still a nice group. We all did what we had to do in Judaism. We had interesting rabbis, interesting things to talk about. We had an array of rabbis because there was always contention, and they didn't last very long, and that always puzzled us. Coming from the East Coast, we never saw such turnover. In about 1960, two people came to me and said, talking about the temple, and all of a sudden they said, "Why don't you run for president?" And I was surprised, and I said, "Why me?" And they made some nice comments. And I think it was the only time that the temple elected a president from the floor rather than the ones that were provided by the committee. And I won the election, and I had an interesting year as president of the congregation of B'nai B'rith. Well, some of the major things that have happened is the building of this temple that made a change. And when Rabbi Cohn came, he made a big difference and still is. And I used to look at that and say, wow, that's so nice. There isn't this turnover. People seem to like him. He's doing a lot of good. And the temple has grown tremendously into all kinds of things that somebody at our age can't always partake in. So we aren't here as often as we'd like to be, but we have this warm feeling that good things are happening. Tell the truth. Try always to tell the truth. Winning the war was extremely important because if you think of the alternative, they joke and say we'd be speaking German and Japanese, and we Jews probably wouldn't even be here. So that was important. As time went on, unfortunately, I noticed that most of the younger generation, or even the middle generation, don't remember those times and don't have a feeling for how important it was to win that war. And now this is my own opinion, even more sadly than that, I find when I talk to them, they don't even know the history of the formation of the country. They just saluted, did what they had to do. I was fortunate in that the war ended, and so I didn't have to experience some of the things that they did. But they really did their part, just about like everyone else.